از کفلیت، گالری مکی، تمام کسایی که کمک کردن در برگزاری این برنامه امشب و به خصوص دکتر اریک هوگلند که قبول کردن برای سخنرانی. من واقعا ایشون 4 صفحه فقط پابلیکیشن دارن روی ایران، 7 کتاب فقط روی ایران دارن به زبان انگلیسی و اولین کسی هستن که کتاب مایسیات شروع رو به انگلیسی ترجمه کردن. دهه 1960 با پیس کورپس به عنوان والنتیر رفتن ایران. از زمان قبل از انقلاب یه چیزی حدود 4 دهه روی ایران کار کردن، کارهای میدانی عمده کردن، به خصوص روی جامعه روستایی. از کتاباشون میتونم اونایی که چیز هست لند اند ریولوشن این ایران که فکر کنم برای کسی که امروز میان جالب باشه. البته این سخنرانی یه ورژن دیگهش در دانشگاه هاروارد چندم 25 آوریل برگزار خواهد شد. یک کنفرانس 2 روزه هست در هاروارد که بعد از اون یک کتابی در خواهد اومد راجع به جوامع روستایی در جهان که بخش خاورمیانه شمال آفریقا رو پروفسور هوگلند می‌نویسن و با فوکس روی ایران. ایشون یعنی اگر من پاسخ بدم که خیلی طول میکشه، ولی من میخوام یه ادعای خیلی پرسونال بیارم توی این معرفی نامه. ایشون استاد من بودن و هستن. با هم یک کتاب هم داریم، Gender Contemporary Iran by Routledge 2011 چاپ شده. ولی اونجا که خیلی مهم هست این هستش که من فکر میکنم یه کسی بودن که مثل یه ستون عظیمی بودن برای خیلی از ماها جونیور اسکالرها که شروع کردیم. یه چیزی بود مثلا من خودم 15 سال پیش شروع کردم، اون موقعی که ما جونیور اسکالر بودیم یه کسی بود مثل اریک هوگلند که پشت ما رو گرفت و 10 ها نفر مثل ما بهش تکیه کردیم، همش ما رو انداخت جلو، دائم پشت ماها رو گرفت و واقعا یکی از ستونهای محکم مطالعات ایران شناسی. من هم به شخصه و پابلیکلی و از ایشون تشکر میکنم و خیلی کار کردم رو مدیون کمک‌هایشون بودم. جدیداً کتابی هم که الان رفت نیویورک چاپ بشه یه فصلش رو خوندن و خوبه که اونجا نبودیم، برای که خیلی گفتن نمیتونی اینو بنویسی، نمیتونی اینو بنویسی، نمیتونی اینو بنویسی. گفتم آره درسته، خب پس من درستش میکنم و همینطوری ادامه میدم به اینکه یکی از کریتیک های محکم کارهای اکادمیک باشن. هر موقع که یکم بالاخره آدم کار خودش رو یکی دیگه میخونه و دعوا میکنن و درستش میکنن. به خاطر همین on that note من پودیوم میدم بهشون. بفرمایید.
خوشحالم که امشب میتونم اینجا باشم با شما بحث کنم. من میهم راجع به تحقیقات هولمون در این چند سال اخیر حرف بزنم و چون من مینویسم به انگلیسی، چون دارم یک کتاب بنویسم و با اجازه من به انگلیسی شروع کنم حرف بزنم. My work on Iran, I guess, begins in 1966, and between 1966 and 1979, I was doing research on rural Iran. I worked with some of the most important rural sociologists and anthropologists in Iran, such as Nader Afshar, Safinejad, and Dr. Azkia. I was in Iran the whole year 78, 79, living in a village, and got to see the revolution in Iran from the perspective of villagers. And I did not have a chance to return to Iran until 1993. And when I went back to Iran, of course, I wanted to go to see my village, and I found that my village was gone and had been replaced by something else. And I was fascinated with these changes, which seemed positive. And I worked very hard to get research grants to go back to Iran, which were hard to get. And I finally was able to go back there in the summer of 1996, and for 3 consecutive summers, I spent the entire summers in Iran doing research on the changes in rural Iran. And I concentrated on the village that I had lived in 78, 79. And what I am doing for that village is writing a longitudinal study to how that village has changed socially, economically, and agriculturally from 1979 up to the present. And so I want to talk mostly tonight about that research in that village and what I have found over the years. The village where I began living in the summer of 1978 is called Guyum, and at the time it was 20 kilometers northwest of Shiraz on the highway, most of it which was unpaved, which went from Shiraz to Yasuj. At the time I lived in the and I moved to the village. It consisted of about 400 households and maybe 2,500 population. So it was a large village by Iranian standards. Iran has approximately 70,000 villages, and less than 10% of them, and certainly in 1970, had more than 2,000 people. Guyum itself had about 1,700 hectares of land under cultivation, and agriculture was the life of the village. And most of the agriculture was irrigated, or what they call Abi, and the Abi agriculture was irrigated from water from a natural spring. Most of this wheat was the main crop, and it was usually planted in the winter, and it stayed, the seeds, in the late fall, the seeds stayed underground and were protected by the snow. And then when the snow melted in the spring, it would cause the seeds to sprout. And so these were ready by May, and late May. And then once it was harvested, this land was planted in a whole variety of summer crops, which were irrigated. And these summer crops included various legumes, such as nahud, and lubia, and a variety of vegetables, cucumbers, tomatoes, and so forth. But an important part of the village land was in orchards, or bog. And they were 2 types of orchards. The main one was the grape orchards, and this village had many boggy angur, and it was famous for its grapes. Part of them were the sour grapes, which were picked and usually smashed up in huge ceramic vessels to make abgoude. And in the other section of the grapes, another part of grapes were either picked to be eaten or dried and made into raisins. So that they also was bogs for various fruits such as apples, pomegranates, and so forth. And it also was a very important source for sumac. The little berries from which sumac are made grew along the irrigation channels from the spring. Other than grapes, the main other fruit which was dry were apricots. There were a lot of apricots in the village. So the village was famous for its abgoude and its lavoushak, with mainly apricot love. Its fields of 1,700 acres were typical, because villages had fields. In other ways, the village was also typical. First, it was what I would call a village, which was a galé. That is, it was totally surrounded by a mud wall, a very high mud wall, which was entered through a huge wooden gate, a central wooden gate. And many of the villages in Fars were what I would call galé villages. The repair of the galé probably had stopped by the 60s, mid-60s, because of there was much more security in Fars province than they had been earlier. Guyoum itself would be the last of the Fars Savant villages, and after Guyoum you begin to get into Lur territory, and many of the Lurs were still practiced in what I call transhumance. That is, they would have summer pastures and winter pastures, and they would move twice a year on these seasonal migrations between the summer and winter pastures. But there were a number of settled Lur villages after Guyoum, and sometimes Guyoum had good relations. Often there were tense relations between the Luri tribes and the villages historically, which is why they tend to be inside galés. Inside this galé, where I lived, was a warren of narrow, winding, and unpaved lanes that connected all of the houses. And most of the houses were made of a mixture of mud and straw, which is called and surrounded each home with its own wall that formed like an internal courtyard. And here, houses, usually there were two-story houses, and the bottom floor was for the stables where the animals were kept, and the upper floors were the people, the upper stories where they lived. And that's where I lived, in one of those types of houses. Now, in 1978, I would say 90% of Iran's 70,000 villages lacked piped water or electricity. Guyoum was a little bit of an exception. In that, in the late 1960s, someone had laid pipes to bring water from the natural spring to the village, and there was a big spigot in the center of the village where people could go get water. And some of the hayats actually had a spigot in their central courtyards, and you could go down from where you lived, right, and stay in your own yard and get water. And since I lived in a house of someone with a little more standing financially than the average person in Guyoum, they had one of these spigots in their own private courtyard. And so I only had to go downstairs every morning to get water to boil, because I was there with a little baby in tow. And we had to make sure she had boiled water. Although I'm sure the spring water was good. For a few times I did drink it and never got sick. Also in the late 60s, when a foreign engineer had installed a motor that provided minimal electricity. That is, it could provide for about maybe 20 of the homes 100 watts of electricity for 6 hours a day. And what 100 watts of electricity meant is that people could have a single light dangling from the ceiling and provide light. But that was some people were happy with that. But the big thing about this village is that it had natural gas. Because the first natural gas pipeline, which was built from the gas fields in the Lur area south of Tehran, close to the Persian Gulf, came to Shiraz, and the pipeline passed right under Guyoum. And the Guyoum people wanted gas, and they didn't get it, so they kept sabotaging the pipeline over a number of years, and finally the authorities gave up and allowed them to be connected. And so this little village of 2,500 people became the first settlement in all of Iran to have natural gas, even before, a few months before Shiraz. And so that actually was a very attractive feature of this village, because even though I had one light bulb, and of course no refrigerator, because that would be too much to power with their electricity. We did have natural gas, and you could cook on natural gas. It was like something like, I don't want to say it was exactly a hot plate, but it had several gas burners, and it was much better than using an Aladdin, which many people did use to cook on. Now, the big problem for most villages in Guyum in 1978 was that they felt they didn't have enough income, and since agriculture was so important, they felt that the whole way land had been redistributed in the village during land reform had been unjust. Now, the land reform program had been inaugurated in Iran, and that's the subject of my first book that we began in 1962. And then it went through many amendments, all the amendments giving more and more, say, sympathetic attention to the plight of the landowners, the landlords rather than the peasant. And so by the time it hit Guyum in 1965, the owner, who by the way was a woman and she owned the whole village, she had the choice of what to do, and she decided to sell the choicest 700 hectares of the village to her overseer, the person who had overseen all the land for her. And so this was a source of conflict in this village. In fact, it was so bad that the owner himself did not live there, because he had been things had been done to his car, like tires cut and slashed over the years. But his brother did, and his brother managed things. So this was a source. But what it, sewer point. So what it meant that of the original 1,700 acres, only 1,000 were available for redistribution. That is, for the government to buy from the landowner and then resell to the peasants, because the peasants had to pay for the land they got. And the way that land reform redistribution took place was that a peasant had to have what was called a haki nasak. The haki nasak was the peasant's right to cultivate land in return for a share of the crop. And not all peasants in a village had a haki nasak. In Guyum, for example, half of the actual adult male heads did not have a haki nasak. And in villages as a whole of Iran, about 50% of peasants did not have this right. And many of them worked as what you might call agricultural laborers, and they got a share of crop from the peasants who had the haki nasak whenever they, in return for the work that they had done during the summer. So in Guyum itself, there were about 300 nasak holding peasants, which meant this 1,000 hectares of land was then available to be resold to 300 peasants. Only the ones who had the nasak were qualified to get land. So even if you assume an equal redistribution, 300 into 1,000 meant that each peasant would get something like 3.3 hectares of land. In actual fact, it wasn't completely equal, because in Guyum, like many other villages, the peasants who had haki nasak usually formed 5-member work teams, and the common term for that is buneh, although buneh only was used in the Tehran, Shari-Ray, up to Karaj, maybe to the west, and maybe to Baramin in the east, Baramin area. But because the initial research was in that area in the 60s, this was a name given to all of them. But they had maybe we've documented at least 25 different names, and in the Shiraz area they didn't recall Harasay. But they were essentially a work team, and they usually were 5 members. And so this is how the land was divided up. And the bonnets were very important, especially for RV agriculture, not so much for grain-fed agriculture. And in some villages, the head of the bonnets, the sarbonnets, who were the person who made sure all the others did the work, was sometimes got a little more of the share of the crop than the other peasant. And they used, in the case of Guillaume, they used these privileges to get more land than the other peasants. So in actual fact, the 300 peasants didn't get 3.3 hectares. Some of them got only 2 hectares, and others got maybe 4 or 5 hectares. In some cases, even 7 or 10. So it was not an equal redistribution. So and this was similar in many other villages, where some of the best land in terms of access, in terms of soil fertility, because you'd have a variety of lands in a plot of 1,700 acres, where some of the best land was kept by the landlord or sold by the landlord to some of his favorite, reducing the amount available to peasants, and then the actual redistribution was not equitable. In addition to having, say, a peasant got only 2 hectares, because of the way the bonnets worked, they had some fields in the best quality land, which would be equal, which would have the best access to the irrigation channel. Some of their fields would be in the more mediocre land, which didn't get as much irrigation water, and other fields would be in the poor, which didn't have any irrigation water at all. And so the fields of any bonnet would be scattered among these different quality soils, and this is what happened during the redistribution, because everyone wanted to have some of the best quality land. So a peasant with 2 hectares of land could have it dispersed in as many as 5 to 8 non-contiguous plots scattered among the different quality. So this was a problem. So overall, there was a lot of disenchantment among the villages about the way land reform was implemented. Many of them felt that it had been unfair and so forth. They complained very bitterly about it. And I would, certainly through the summer of '78, I was picking it up. It was during the summer of '78, especially at the end of the summer, that this revolutionary movement, I would say, began to gather steam. So you know, the 85th march in Tehran, and that was going to be a big march on the parliament to demand free elections, and that was all stifled by what we call Maidani Jaleh. And then after Maidani Jaleh, the country began to gradually go on what I call these mass strikes in all the sectors of the economy. And in the village of Guillaume, the people most interested in what was going on was a group of young men aged 18 to 22, almost all married or a few engaged to be married. This particular group of young men actually had attended high school in Shiraz, and they were the first young men from this village ever to get a high school education. And they had different attitudes. They were role models for the other young men their age who had not gone to high school, and they were very much interested in this revolutionary movement. In particular, one of them, who became my best friend, had actually not just gone to high school, but he had gone to Teachers College, and that summer had graduated from Teachers College and now was a teacher. And he was very much looked up to for his education and his skills as a singer of traditional music and a dancer of traditional song, all of these qualifications. And he and these other young men began to start organizing the villages. Now, their parents were very upset, and what was very interesting, these young men defied their parents, especially their fathers. So this had never happened before in this village. And these young men were, in one case, I remember I saw where this young man was ready to attack his father, who was quite old. And then he didn't go home for a long time. So you had a complete role reversal, where young men in this village were insisted that they were going to be respected. So you reversing the generations, and it turned out that these same things were happening in several villages around the Tehran area. So these young men began organizing. They found where to sleep when the gendarmerie came, so they never could find them. And they were doing things like that. And they began, once the big demonstrations in Shiraz, they began going to Shiraz. And from December on, they began organizing convoys, and they insisted their sisters come with them, because the Khomeini had said that, which was a big thing. And by this time, the parents were actually, well, very nervous, but scared of their young sons who were being so belligerent, and they were emergent as a power, and you began to see, and these villages now began to provide the mass in a city like Shiraz and many others of people coming in. So you would see truckloads, even farther away from Guyum, but in the Guyum area they organized several of the villages, Hossein-abad, which is close to Shiraz, Do-Guhak, which was close, and Gomshe, which is close to Guyum. The Guyum young men were organizing groups in these villages. You'd have these little pickup truckloads of people going into the big demonstrations in Shiraz, and especially for the ones during Moharram in December '78 and later. And it was the groups from Shiraz who these accelerated after the Shah departed the country in January. And it was actually the young men from Shiraz who went and attacked the Savat building in Shiraz and took it out and opened it up for everyone to come in. So the Guyum young men got quite a reputation for being quite militant. After the revolution, one of the interesting things, again spiked by these young men, is they decided that with the revolution it was time to do something about land reform, and so they expropriated the 700 hectares of the owner who had sold the person who owned it, had bought it from the original land in 1965. And there was a number of villages expropriating land. It got very serious, as you may remember, in Turkmen Sarah and in the Kurdish areas, especially Kurdistan and northern Kermanshah, in that Kurdish area of West Azerbaijan, south of Urumiyeh, Mahabad, in that area. And in fact, it got so bad the government intervened in August, and they got all tied up with a lot of other things, Kurdish rights and so forth. But the initial spark for all the problems in Kurdistan came from these land expropriations. I don't want to get into the details of this, but the owner of the land who was expropriated, who was known as a smuggler and living quite a wild life and had a nice home in Tehran, suddenly discovered religion. And for years he tried to get his land back. I think in 1982, a Tehran court ruled that he had the right to have his land back, but the court in Shiraz refused to implement the Tehran order, and this went on for years. And so as a result, the 700 acres remained contested, and when I went there back for the first time in '93, it was still being contested. And it finally wasn't resolved until 2001, when the owner and the peasants agreed to split that land. So, but in that period, it really wasn't used very much, because if the landlord tried to plant anything, the peasants would rip it up. So that was it. But what I want to focus on is not that particularly, but my return to the village. What I want to say, what I described as a village which didn't have many amenities, and actually most people were very poor in the village. I would say maybe 10% of the villages in 78 had income to have a comfortable life, and the rest were subsistence. When I went back for the first time in 1993, I was somewhat in a state of shock because the village was gone. In place of the Galais was this like little town almost of of brick houses, fired brick houses, not mud brick, fired regular bricks that are fired in a kiln. And they were set up in a grid pattern with maybe 10 houses on what could be a street but wasn't paved, and go down there with the more houses behind them. And this was on both sides of the highway, which was the one that went to Yasu. The ruins of the Galais you could see behind the row on one side, but within the Galais, most of the houses had been, destroyed and remade into these fired brick houses. So this was amazing for me, that this was like a little town, and everyone had electricity. And so I go and I stayed with the same family I had stayed with in 78, who happened to be the family of this teacher. And I was in a state of shock. They had electricity, which meant what? They had a refrigerator. They had a television set. They had a shower in the house because they had piped water now too, I should say. I mean, not these spigots out in the yard, but sink kitchens with sinks with water coming out, and showers, and nobody was using the public bath, which had fallen to disuse. So I was kind of surprised by all of this, amazed by it, and they had these appliances, and every year that I went back they had more and more appliances, and I wanted to see what was the source of this change, where was the money coming from. And how did it happen? And some of the things were happening as I went around to other villages. You could see that these were happening. In some villages, actually, the changes were much more accelerated than they were in Guyum, and others they weren't as accelerated. So there was all kinds of variety. And so when I began the research phase, the concentrated research phase, and that was the summers of 96, 97, and 98, when I was going around doing all the research, I was trying to find out the source. And what I found out was 40% of the families relied primarily, and in some cases exclusively, on income that was earned in Shiraz. They were no longer dependent on agriculture, even though they may still have a bog and they had some produce. Most of it was for this domestic consumption, or if it was being sold, it was minor, it wasn't considered part of their income. The household income, the real household income, was coming from work in Shiraz. Now, Shiraz's population had actually doubled after the revolution, so it was no longer the city of 450,000 that it was in 1978, or by 1996, 97, 98, it was a city of over 1.2 million. And with that doubling of population came a doubling, even tripling of the job opportunities development. All these little factories around Shiraz, in Shiraz, more shops. So there were lots of job opportunities, both for people with not many skills, as many of the village young men did not have, but also those who had some kind of high school education, semi-skill. So about 40% of the people were actually commuting to jobs in Shiraz on a daily basis. And Shiraz actually had moved closer. For those of you who know Shiraz, in 1978, Ghasral Dasht was the end of Shiraz, and after that it was all very rural. Well, Ghasral Dasht was now the city, the center of, basically part of the center of Shiraz. The center had expanded all the way to Ghasral Dasht, and there was another area, what used to be the village of Hossein-abad had completely disappeared. There's another whole area called Maliabad, and so, and Shiraz was creeping out. There was a new Sharat, which had not yet been annexed by Shiraz, called Golistan. So the city was creeping out. And the only two villages, you had to go all the way to Dokuhat before you got to a village. And Dokuhat was even becoming more urbanized than Guyum was. And I would say I could see the urban city coming into Guyum because so 40% of households depended on work from home. In addition, in Guyum, because they were these people who worked in Shiraz and got salaries and had money, you had in Shiraz, in this Guyum, you had along this highway, the street, this highway to Shiraz, the section in Guyum now was like the main street of Guyum, and shops were along that. Grocery shops, pastry shops, tailor, hairdresser, and so 10% of the population were proprietors of these shops. So we're talking about 50% of the population. Plus there were people who would, what I would call working in what I would call a public sector which had developed in this village, because there was an elementary school for boys, an elementary school for girls, a high school for boys, a high school for girls, and a religious seminary to train preachers, plus a health clinic. And so all of these had jobs, teachers and janitors and so forth. And so these occupied another 10% of families had someone who worked in this, what I would call the public sector. So the actual number of people in Guyum who were dependent on agriculture, families, households, was about 30%. Now this had fallen, in 1978 it would have been something like 90%. So you already see the following, the fall off in that. And as I said, 700 hectares was still contested, but 1,000 hectares was still being farmed, usually by people who lived in Shiraz. And some people actually moved to Shiraz and kept their grape orchards and would come back to them. But what was interesting, these were no longer being cooperatively worked. They were worked by one person, and usually someone who had done that as a child, and their children, their sons, were not working with them. Their sons were getting an education and had no interest in agriculture work. And there was a big question of what would happen to this land that was being farmed. Well, the years that I went back to do the main substantive research in 96, 97, and 98, I saw gradually people selling part of their land and not doing agriculture. And well, I couldn't go back for entire summers. I was back there in 99 for 2 weeks. I was back there in maybe 2001 for 2 weeks, 2003 again, and in 2005. I've been back since 2005, but I would say 2005 was the last time I actually collected data. And so in all of these trips that I go back, I see that the village is becoming more prosperous. What do I mean by that? More consumer goods, which I also see in the cities, by the way. So my friends in the cities in Shiraz and Tehran are actually acquiring new consumer goods after 93 and moving to bigger houses. And in Guyum, they are building bigger houses and fancier houses. So you see this urban, what I call, now not everyone is participating in the urban middle class culture, but you have the emergence of what I call an urban middle class culture in the cities in Iran, and some of it is moving into villages like Guyum. That doesn't mean there wasn't people who were not poor. You still had poor. But for a village like Guyum, the ideal, even for the poor, was to have these consumer goods. And so the definition of poverty changes. In 1978, I would say people were poor if they didn't have enough food. That was no longer the issue in 78 because people could get from various charities such as the Imam Khomeini relief committee and so forth, if they really had no money at all, they could get help with food and with other and with the utility bills and so forth, and even get help with rent. So the type of poverty which was defined by not having enough food or income is gone, and now it seems that people call themselves poor, mostazafin, if all they had was a black and white small TV instead of a color TV with a mobile, if they had a motorcycle instead of a car, if they had, if they had maybe a cheap manufactured rug from China instead of a hand-knotted Iranian rug on their living room floor, if they still slept on lahaf, which they rolled out at night, instead of a bed, which is now popular among the middle class, if they ate on the floor instead of a rounded table, which the middle class in this village were doing. So there were all these different ways that being poor was being what we might call redefined and renegotiated. And it doesn't mean that if one didn't have all these consumer goods that they wanted, it doesn't mean they didn't feel bad and envious, which they did, and angry, and they still had this low self-esteem because the way that this middle class society was involved in, your value is being evaluated on the amount of money you earn, not on what your personal aspects were doing. So, but these were all things that I saw in transition in this period going on, in this whole period. And meanwhile, as peasants were getting older, or farmers were getting older, and their sons didn't want the land, they had to decide what to do. And they began selling land to people who were willing to pay for it. And who were these? These were not people who wanted more land. These were people in Shiraz who wanted a house on this land. And so so in this village, land was gradually being sold for what they call saktamum sazi, not agriculture. And in 2001, I said there was finally this settlement where the absentee landowner agreed to give half of the 700 acres to the peasants who had been trying to get it, and he would have half, and they agreed to that, and of course he sells his half. And soon the peasants began to sell their half because they could get more money for Saktamon Sazi. So between 2001 and 2005, this land disappears, and in 2005, the amount of land under cultivation in Guyum had fallen to 100 hectares. Now, this was a village which once had 1,700 hectares of land under cultivation, and it has fallen to 100.
Irrigation water, are they eroding this?
Well, they still have irrigation water, yeah, but people that's not the problem. Isn't so much in Shiraz and other villages. People like digging wells and groundwater sources are drying up. So Guyum in many ways is very typical of villages around big cities. Shiraz, Esfahan, Mashhad, Tehran, especially Tehran. Karaj, which I guess we could call a big city or a big suburb, is now one of those places with over 1 million people. But it does have an independent personality, but it's more part of suburban Tehran. Tabriz. So you see that in all of these places, good agricultural land has been being used for building houses. And what I see, one of the things of doing Guyum is one to see the positive changes, and it is positive to see people having more income, but I also want to see the negative changes. And my argument is there's some very negative changes for the future of agriculture in Iran. First and foremost, I would say would be the land use itself, that the best agricultural land, especially near the big cities, is being transferred from use for crops, edible and other crops, for industrial or residential purposes, because there's also land being used for industrial. And I've already given you the example of Guyum, and there are many others you can see, and not just big cities. I've even seen it in smaller places such as Beishah up along the Caspian, Sari, and Rash probably would be one of the big cities, but even in smaller cities. So this is a problem of land use. There's also the whole problem of land fragmentation. I've told you the problem in Guyum. Even in villages which are remote enough from the cities, but have good water for irrigation, and so agriculture has not declined, the problem of land fragmentation does what? It discourages the use of tractors, because if you have your land divided into 8 separate quarter-hectare plots, tractors don't make sense. Although tractors make it more efficient to plow the soil and so forth. So the land fragmentation and the dispersal of, say, and still the average, I would say 75% of land, agricultural land is owned in less than 6-acre tracts, which are dispersed into several plots. So these are very it makes it very difficult to because of the land fragmentation. They have use of mechanical equipment, and in fact there is minimal use of mechanical equipment on much of agriculture. Now they are large landowners that have over 20 hectares of land, in some cases up to 500 hectares. And of course these are mechanized, heavily mechanized, and more the main agricultural production is coming from these larger land holdings which are mechanized. But one of the other interesting aspects of Iran is the minimal use of pesticides, whether on mechanized or small landowners. And there seems to be limited knowledge about crop diseases and how to control them. In addition, I would say in the early years after the revolution, there was considerable investment in agriculture. I would say after beginning around 1992, there's been gradually less government money being put into agriculture and agricultural development, and more into industry and industrial development. And so the money for investment in agriculture, both from the government and also from banks who could give loans at very low interest rates, are drying up, and this creates a problem of high indebtedness among many farmers, and they're forced to sell their crops in advance for less money than they might get if they sold them when they were ready for the market. So these are now emerging as problems for agriculture, and for villages which are remote, there is a major difference between the price that middlemen pay for the crop and what it's sold for in the urban market. Now, it's interesting that there's maybe 10 young men in Guyum who act as middlemen and have pickup trucks that drive to these remote villages and actually buy crops for low prices, and you can put them in that pickup trucks and get them to the market in Shiraz when they're still fresh and make a big profit, and they're paying very little to. This is a problem. There is also no national crop production program. What do I mean by that? Say that 1 year the price of tomatoes is very high, and everyone then wants to plant tomatoes, and there's no way of saying, well, there'll be too much tomatoes and there'll be a glut of tomatoes, and that's what happens, and the price of tomatoes go all down. That happens with many crops because there's no national crop production program, and doesn't seem to be interest in any of this. I would say has to do with the gradual prejudice moving towards industry and away from agriculture. And the final problem, I would argue, is there's no government-supported floor price for crops. What do I mean by a floor price? That is, if there is a floor price, say that is equivalent to or even a little higher than the actual production cost to, say, produce maybe say nuhud, and if there is a glut of nuhud and the price goes down, it falls below the actual production cost to produce that crop. A floor price would mean the government would buy it at the minimum. In that way, while the farmer might not make much profit, they wouldn't lose anything and go into debt. And of course, this is offered for many crops in the U.S. and the EU. So this is not anything unusual. So there's no government-supported floor price for most crops. There is one, I should point out, for wheat and rice and sugarcane, but other than those three crops, there isn't any. So all of these problems, which are problems that I didn't necessarily come to on my own, they were brought to me by the Jihad Sazandagi people. And I would say this organization is very sensitive to the to what's going on with the peasants. In fact, it is the Jihad Sazandagi which is responsible for building all these piped water networks in the villages, building electricity generating plants for villages, building roads for villages to connect them. And the Jihad Sazandagi, which is another whole separate study I've done, has been a very successful organization. But it was, after '92, forcibly merged with the Ministry of Agriculture. And the Ministry of Agriculture tends to be staffed by bureaucrats who are very urban and have no sensitivity to the concerns of the villages, which is not much different from probably agricultural ministries in many countries in the West, including the EU. The difference in the EU, the farmers have a big lobby, and in Iran they do not. So what does all this mean? I would say what is fascinating in the long run is, the villages in Iran have really been transformed since the revolution, and in many ways that is a success story, that there was an ideology to transform the villages so that people would want to live in them and not move to the city. And most of those villages has been transformed, and it was done through the Jihad Sazandagi, many officials are village people, like the ones I described to you at the very beginning when I met in '78 in Guyun, people from the villages who know what's going on. The Jihad Sazandagi, for all its good work, has since '92 it has really lost its political influence as the political elite, whatever you want to call it, people who run the government, have been putting more emphasis on industrial projects and industrial development. And so for the long run, I don't know what that will mean for agriculture. But if I finish this longitudinal study, that'll be my next book, and we might have some ideas 2 or 3 years. Thank you. I'll take questions.